Welcome to Speak Our Minds, the fight for youth mental health, the podcast that delves into the inspiring journey of youth mental health advocates who took a stand and transformed a system. Together with your host, Heidi Baskfield, we'll explore the landmark lawsuit that held the state of Colorado accountable for failing to provide essential youth mental health services and won. In each episode, we'll unpack the intricate details of the lawsuit, guiding you through the legal battles and the monumental settlement that set the foundation for a working system of mental health. We'll examine the steps Colorado is now taking to build a comprehensive and effective mental health care system for its youth, highlighting both the challenges and the triumphs along the way. Join us as we learn from experts in other states who have successfully navigated similar crises, offering invaluable insights and strategies. Hear firsthand accounts from parents, providers, and professionals who are deeply committed to ending Colorado's youth mental health crisis. Their stories and perspectives will shed light on the impact of the lawsuit and the hopeful path forward. Whether you're a concerned parent, a mental health professional, or an advocate for change, this podcast is your guide to understanding the profound transformation taking place in Colorado's youth mental health landscape. Welcome to Speak Our Minds, the fight for youth mental health. Let's embark on this journey together.
I want to begin today by welcoming our guest, Dr. Terri Bissonette. Terri, thank you so much for being here. It is way too often that as we're having conversations about system reform and the youth mental health crisis, that we aren't talking specifically about the Native and Indigenous communities. And we're so thrilled to have you help us and guide us in thinking about this more and making sure that we're being very intentional about how we ensure that systems that we're working to reform or build are being responsive to the needs of Native and Indigenous youth. So thanks for being here today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you start off just, telling everybody a little bit about yourself, your tribal affiliations, and the work that you currently do on behalf of these communities?
Yes, my name is Terri Bissonette. I am Gnoozhekaaning Anishinaabe, which I'm an enrolled member of the Bay Mills Indian community, and I'm also a Little Traverse Band Odawa. I am a longtime educator. I have two kids. I have a 29-year-old and a 16-year-old. My son's still in high school. And I started out as a reading teacher, also worked as a full-time instructor at Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation in their teacher training program. And most recently founded and ran the American Indian Academy of Denver, which was a charter school authorized through Denver Public Schools that focused, our target population was Indigenous/Native/Latino students in the Denver metro area. Mm-hmm. And we were in operation for 3 years. Unfortunately, we opened during the pandemic, which was a huge disadvantage for us, but we ended up closing after our third year due to low enrollment.
Sure.
And so now I am working as an independent consultant. I still do a lot of Native youth kind of service programming, mm-hmm. especially around cultural immersion and different things that land-based learning, different things that we were doing at the school. I'm still engaging in some of that work. But other than that, I'm working as an independent consultant right now.
Thank you. I do want to talk more about the charter school that you started and ran, and specifically what need was it that you saw was not being met that really motivated you to move in that direction? Why did you even want to do that?
Well, it's been a pretty well-known data point that our students, especially in Denver, but this is statewide in Colorado and also nationwide, Native students have the worst graduation rates and the highest dropout rates in the country. The disparity between any other ethnicity or race is pretty stark.
Sure.
And in Denver, in particular, Denver public schools, they graduate about 50% of their Native American students on a yearly basis. And this is a decades-long problem. And so that's been pretty well established. And that was one of the main focuses of why we started the school. But for me personally, I had the couple years prior to starting the kind of the application process and the community meetings and the design and all of that stuff, I had been doing a lot of work around trauma-informed programming and trauma-informed schools. And in particular, the impact that historical trauma has had on our Native communities, especially around boarding schools and also land loss and different, various federal Indian policies and the impacts that they've had on our communities. And so that really led me to a better understanding, a deeper understanding of why our students tend to struggle in traditional schools and mainstream schools. And it really has a lot to do with the impact and just the perpetuation of historical trauma on mental health.
The reason why today's discussion is so important is because there's over 42,000 Native and Indigenous youth in the state of Colorado. And according to the United States Office of Minority Health, roughly 70% of all Native and Indigenous community members will experience a mental health challenge at some point in their lifetime. That's a shocking statistic. When you add on top of that the same office reports that young Indigenous females ages 15 to 19 have a death rate as a result of a mental health challenge that is 5 times higher than their white peers, what we can clearly see is that the system as it is designed now is not serving tribal and Indigenous youth in any kind of effective manner.
And so we opened a middle school. We opened with 6, 7, and 8. As I mentioned before, we opened during the pandemic. So we opened in 2020 and full remote, had never been a school before. Did really well that first year in full remote. And then in the spring, we became hybrid. So we had about half of our students were coming in, 2 or 3 days a week or switching off every other week. And so that worked out really well. The second year, when students came back from that trauma of being at home and being isolated and not being, just not having their regular routine, not being in school, it was very, very difficult for us as a brand new school. We didn't have any prior school culture or just the context. We didn't have any of that to kind of fall back on. And so we were trying to build that while also dealing with what I call, a severe mental health crisis.
Yes.
That year that everybody came back from the pandemic. And so the second year really sunk us, and it was very, very hard for us to kind of climb out of that. It felt like we could never really string 2 good days together. The way that I describe it is we were dealing with behaviors at the front of the building. So, kids just really acting out and having to deal with behaviors and discipline and things like that. And then in the back of the building where we had our social worker, our school psych, and a community counseling service that we had partnered with in the back of the building. And that's where we were really dealing with a lot of suicide ideation and just kids breaking down, having, mental breakdowns in the middle of the day. So it was just this constant dealing. Like, I don't think anybody learned, or they may have learned 1 or 2 things, but it wasn't a year of learning. It was really a year of just trying to keep everybody together.
Yeah. Well, talking more about that specifically, Terri, I mean, when you talk through that very complicated situation that you were working to support and run a school amidst, what were you really seeing as informing the crisis that your students were dealing with, right? Like the country as a whole was definitely acknowledging youth were in crisis, but in your specific community and the kids that you were working to support, what did you really notice as their big challenges? I mean, you talked about, generational trauma. I'm curious, like how that was factoring into this situation. Like, say more and talk in more detail about what you were seeing your kids really try to navigate their way through.
I think that the intergenerational trauma that our communities experience added layers on top of just the general mental health issues that were happening in every community coming out of the pandemic. And I think that it just exacerbated what was already there. And so we had, and I think for us, and you mentioned that we are rarely addressed, right? We're rarely focused upon, and not just mental health issues, but in all kinds of, areas, right? Because our numbers are low. And so we tend to be kind of overlooked. And we have a special relationship with the federal government. We are not only a race and ethnicity, but we're also political entities. So it makes us kind of different, right?
Yeah.
But for us, I think in what I saw with the kids was that, so our families, they're not fully aware of the impact that intergenerational trauma is having on them. And so without that awareness, there's a tendency to just have kind of these reactionary outbursts. And that's what we were seeing with the kids for the most part. And like I said, it was very much, we had a group of kids that were just really acting out. And I know that this is probably not the best way to describe it, but I often say it's almost like our kids were out in the woods for a year being raised by wolves, and they came back to society and had no idea
how to assimilate.
How to conduct themselves, how to cope, how to sit still, how to be in a room, like how to get along. All of those kinds of things just went right out the window. And so we had that group of kids, and then we had another group of kids that had just completely internalized all of that isolation and all of that just deep sense of being alone and being on their own and not having anybody. And so they too, it was really a very dichotomous situation that way. So for us, even though at the time going into it, we felt like we had accounted for, we had 2 full-time special education teachers on staff, year one, knowing that our kids tend to be, overrepresented in SPED. Denver Public Schools, their schools on average have about 11% of their population are on IEPs. Sure. We were experiencing around 20%. We knew that we were going to have a higher percentage. So we hired 2 full-time special education teachers, knowing that we were going to have a large number, even though we only had 100 kids. We only had 100 kids that first year. And we had partnered with Denver Public Schools with a social worker and a school psych, but they were only there 1 day a week. And then we partnered with a community counseling service, and they were coming in 10 hours a week and servicing 10 kids as well, just with mental health services.
Sure.
In addition to that, we're also offering, I think it was 3 to 5 sessions for family members and also staff members. And so we felt like we had gone into it with eyes wide open. We really felt like we were ready, and we were not ready at all. Like that second year, we were completely overwhelmed. We were completely underwater. Like I said, we couldn't string 2 good days together of not having one major incident or another. And really, in hindsight, we were also hearing from other schools that, there were other schools that were even worse off than we were, just because we did have such a small staff to student ratio. And so, we were able to respond to things very quickly and, and really start to develop relationships with our kids. As Indigenous people, we're very relational.
Yeah.
And so our worldview, that's what it's predicated upon, is the relationships that we have with each other, the relationships that we have with all living beings and also all non-living beings. And so that's really what we kept coming back to, was just those relationships and building those relationships. And so the third year, and I will say, we implemented at the end of the year, we designed a behavioral mental health kind of intervention and support system, similar to PBIS, which is the positive behavior intervention system that a lot of schools use. But we indigenized it, and it was really based on our traditional values, especially respect, relationships, responsibility, and reciprocity. And so we had explicit lessons, and we had, we really built that system. At the end of the second year, started to see some improvement the last couple months of the school year. And then the following year, our third year, which ended up being our last, unfortunately, just because we were able to start with that system on day one, we saw drastic improvements in students not only their behavior, but just happiness level, their feelings of safety, their
Sure.
feelings of belonging, all of that kind of stuff, all of the things that we said we were going to set out to do, especially that sense of belonging and feeling safe and feeling like you're connected to something and have just developing that stronger sense of identity, which I think is so important for our kids because that's the major thing that they've lost. When we talk about historical trauma, talk about intergenerational trauma, yes, it's all steeped in violence, and violence has its own layers, but ultimately it's being stripped of your identity and not knowing who you are and not having that sense of self. And so that third year, that's what we started seeing was students who really started to understand who they were and really being able to take pride in that and seeing the legacy of their ancestors and the legacy of who they are as Indigenous people. And so, with that, we saw improvements with mental health. We saw improvements with their happiness level. And it was a beautiful thing. It was also a tragic thing just because we weren't able to see it to its full potential, just because we closed.
I want to talk a little bit more. I want to delve in more on the intergenerational trauma component, because I think, in non-Indigenous communities, we're only just now having these larger conversations about the impacts of boarding schools as just one example of way too many in which Indigenous communities were stripped of their right to live and live in the ways that they had always up to that point. And I think what's hard to describe to people is how an impact to your grandparents or great grandparents lives and breathes in and through into your children's experience. So when you're trying to talk to people about intergenerational harm created from actions taken many years ago, how do you describe that to people? Like, how do you say that harm, that emotional harm, lives on in as strong a way as it did when it initially happened? I think it's hard for people to understand that concept. So any sort of light you can shed on that would be really great.
Well, first, it's important to understand that it wasn't that long ago. So my mom, who is still with us, she's 84 years old, is a boarding school survivor. My mom, when she was born, spoke Ojibwe, and she ended up going to a boarding school in Harbor Springs, Michigan. After World War II, so my mom was born in 1940, and my grandfather had a really good job at a weapons factory during the war. And after the war ended and he lost that job due to economics and really due to pressure from the social services in Michigan, was told, send your oldest kids to the boarding school so that you can go get a job in Detroit. And my mom at the time was only 6 years old and her older brother was 7. They were the first two that went. If you could imagine being sent off to a boarding school at 6 years old. And immediately upon arriving, had her language beaten out of her. So she learned English rather quickly because that's what you do when you know that it's a kind of a life or death situation, and completely forgot her native tongue. And it wasn't until I was 19 years old, and I will never forget this because my mom never mentioned anything. She never said a word. She had moved to Denver during the relocation era. So in the 50s and 60s, the federal government was incentivizing Native individuals and also families to move to urban areas to kind of get them off the reservation. The hope was that they could disband reservations and that tribes would kind of cease to exist because people would just assimilate into urban areas. And so my mom moved out to Denver with her best friend. And so I was born and raised in Denver. And like I said, she never mentioned this story to me. I was going to the University of Colorado and I had an assignment where I had to interview a family member about their education experience when I was 19. And it was the first time she ever told the story out loud. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I could even relay the story without completely breaking down.
Of course.
Because in the midst of all of this, my mom was being told at the boarding school that she was a dirty little Indian and that she would never amount to anything. And she actually went to college to, be just kind of in spite of the nuns, and ended up, my mom has 4 degrees now, right? She's overdone it with school. But it wasn't until she was relaying this story to me that I realized, when she was telling me this story, that she was an English language learner. And my mom always thought that she had some kind of learning disability or she was dyslexic. She always had problems with reading, but she would just persevere and just push through. She just had this she's one of the most stubborn people I know. And so she just has that grit about her that she's just not going to let anyone tell her that she can't do something.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until she told that story that we realized that she was an English language learner, and that even though she no longer on a conscious level could speak Ojibwe and understand it, subconsciously, she was processing in 2 different languages.
When Terri's talking about the impacts of generational trauma on entire communities of Indigenous and Native youth, one of the things that pops out to me is a statistic by the American Psychological Association, which is saying that the highest rates of lifetime major depressive disorders originate out of Native and Indigenous communities. Clearly, what Terri is talking about is in fact being demonstrated by the data.
And so that's the first thing to understand, is that this is not that long ago. And thinking about that, it wasn't until 1976 that we had the freedom to practice our own religion. 1976.
Right.
I was born in 1970.
Yeah.
So
yesterday.
So that's really, really important, because I think that, this idea that it happened so long ago and why can't we get over it? And how is this, after so many generations, how is this impacting? That's really important. The other thing is that because it's been unresolved, because this is unresolved trauma, when we are just now in 2024, 2023, just now the United States is coming to this realization and this reckoning of what has happened. Because boarding schools, we're talking about a history of well over 100 years that was the official policy of the United States, was to contract with the different religious organizations. And of course, at first it was the military to educate us. And so we didn't have our freedom until the 1970s to even educate our own children. We were told by the federal government how to educate our children, where they were to be sent, all of that kind of stuff. So that's why those wounds are still so fresh. And like I said, in an urban population, our students in Denver really identify with being urban kids, inner city kids, a lot of the times. And they may know that they're Native, they may know that they're Indigenous, but they don't know a lot about it for the most part. But yet they're still being impacted by all of that. And like I said, because there's not this awareness, even in our own community, we're being impacted by things that we can't even address, because we're not even aware that we're being impacted by it. We're just here reacting and trying to survive and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think that that's the biggest thing that I would like people to take away, is that not only does there need to be an awareness raised in the broader population and the broader, communities, but also within our own communities, because that's really the only way that we can accurately address all of it.
Right. Well, that makes sense to me completely. And I appreciate you being so clear on, this is still very much a living, breathing dynamic. Families are trying to understand for themselves. And when I think about that with respect to young people and families trying to understand what's going on within their own familial context, and then knowing how to respond or what to do or where to go to get help. When I think of what's out there, and if these families are still trying to understand the impact of these historical actions on them, how are providers supposed to understand and then make sure that the kind of care that they're providing and the interventions that they're using are being effective and responsive? So when you think about where these kids and families are turning for help, What are you hearing? What are you seeing? Where do they go when they're having these mental health struggles?
One of the things in Denver in particular, and I don't know a lot about outside of Denver, but Denver was one of the first official relocation cities back in the 50s and 60s. So we used to have a full-fledged Indian Health Service hospital in Denver. And we still have the Denver Indian Health and Family Services, which is a clinic. They also offer behavioral and mental health services there. And I don't know, I think, and they also have something called Native Connections, which is a suicide prevention, like lifeline. And also you can schedule appointments if you're, thinking about ending your life and things like that. There's also there's an organization called the Native American Counseling and Healing Collective. And that's a group of Native therapists that started that organization, and they offer counseling, individual counseling, and maybe even family counseling. I think this is the case, not just in our community, but in a lot of communities, is just there's an overwhelming need and there's not enough mental health services to go around.
When Terri talks about communities not having access to providers, she's not kidding. According to a recent report by the American Psychological Association, less than 1% of psychologists in this country identify as American Indian. Further, there are fewer than 200 doctoral-level American Indian psychologists in the entire United States. Clearly, there is work to be done in both developing and supporting Native American and Indigenous providers, as well as ensuring that existing providers have the kind of cultural competency to serve such a diverse population.
I was actually talking to a friend of mine who recently she was actually a student at Oglala Lakota College of mine, and she became a school counselor. And then she got her licensure to be a mental health provider. And now she's working in a community mental health organization that services primarily just the Native population in Rapid City. And she was telling me that at the height of coming back from the pandemic, I think they had a 6-month waiting list.
Sure.
And now it's about 8 to 12 weeks. So we're talking, that's just an unbelievable amount of time for people to have to wait to get mental health services. And I don't think that is unusual. I just don't think that there's enough providers. I don't think that there's enough services. I don't think that the schools are well equipped. I know our school wasn't. That third year we brought in an additional counselor from that counseling service that we partnered with. They were there 20 hours a week. We had a full-time, we made the school psych full-time and the social worker full-time, in addition to 2 special education teachers. And we did better. We definitely did a lot better. But it's just there's an overwhelming need. And I think so access to those resources is something that's needed. I think that training for providers is also something that's needed.
Yeah.
I know that there's currently an interim committee right now in the Colorado State Legislature on Native American Affairs or American Indian Affairs that's going to be proposing. I think they're going to come out with 3 or 4 pieces of legislation to propose for the 2025 legislative session. And one of them is for there to be specific Native/Indigenous cultural training for medical providers. I hope that also includes mental health providers as well, because I think that there needs to be an understanding of the impact of historical trauma. We're not the only community that has experienced historical trauma by any means, but the impact that we experience is unique to us, and it does still have that perpetuation. It's still impacting our communities today.
Yeah. Well, earlier when you were talking about the mental health intervention that you were using more broadly within your school context, you actually used the word indigenize as a way to say we took a evidence-based tool and then we adjusted it so that it would fit and be responsive to our cultural context. And I'm wondering, like when you talk about the value of training, I couldn't agree more. We need providers to understand these dynamics so they can be responsive to the youth that they're giving care to. How do you build into this broader system of Medicaid in our state, as an example, this ability to ensure that different mental health interventions supporting youth are quote unquote indigenized? Like what needs to happen? Who needs to get this training at this point? And who is best equipped to provide it?
I think anybody that is interacting, if they are servicing families and children that are on Medicaid, I think that those providers would definitely need training that was focused on just our unique issues and unique worldview.
Yeah.
And what is kind of best practices? What are those best practices that really get to the bottom of things and help to alleviate some of this pain and these issues, I think is really important. I am a firm believer that those of us that are from these communities should be providing the training.
Yeah.
And I know that, Denver Indian Health, when we talk specifically about Denver Indian Health and Family Services, there are definitely resources out there. I know the National Indian Education Association, even when we talk about educators and schools, they have resources and trainers and all of that kind of stuff for the schools. So I think there are resources out there for organizations to be able to tap into. I do love the idea that, the state legislature is recognizing that there needs to be more training. And so, they're going to find the money for that and, really propose that legislation to see if we can get some more specialized training. And it's not just like cultural responsiveness, but it's really specific to who we are as Indigenous people and as the original inhabitants of this land. And so I think that that's really important.
Sure. Like your experiences in the trauma space are a result of a very specific set of circumstances, and providers need to understand how to support the impacts of that. And so I agree with you. I think it shows progress that we're even having this conversation, let alone that legislative committees are talking about the need to embed this kind of training in the system. When we talk about system change going forward, even beyond the current interim committee, it's critically important that Indigenous and Native populations are given a voice and taking a seat at the table and saying what they need. How do we ensure for that? What kind of outreach needs to happen? How do we empower tribal and Indigenous youth and their leaders and communities to feel like they are wanted and their needs will be addressed?
All I can think of is that I feel like in the last couple of years, there really does seem to be more outreach happening. And I think that just needs to continue. I think that there has been a recognition and an acknowledgement that it's important to have, representation matters. And if it's about us, then we need to be in the room talking about us. It can't be folks who are not us talking about us. And I think that there has been, in a lot of spaces, in more and more spaces, there's been a recognition that Indigenous/Native people, and we kind of do interchange Native American, American Indian, Indigenous. When I talk about Native people, I am talking about Native Americans who are affiliated or enrolled in tribes here in the United States.
Yes.
In a broader sense, and of course, in my work as an educator, recognize all Indigenous people, especially Indigenous people of Turtle Island, which encompasses, from Canada all the way down to the tip of Mexico. And so I do think that there has been more of a recognition. I think that needs to continue. And I think that, making sure and encouraging that our youth are going into these fields and are excited about being educated and getting their licensure and, and all of that kind of stuff, because it's really important for us. Because a lot of the issue sometimes is that there's not enough of us.
Yeah.
On that professional level that we have it's not a very deep pool, right? And so we all get pulled in 50 million directions and we're asked to do 50 million things because there's not enough of us to ask. And so the more that our kids coming up, our young people that are coming up are educated and get into these professions, the better off we will all be, because we'll have a deeper pool and we will have more representation.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Terri Bissonette, I could talk to you for days and days and days, and I hope that you will keep this conversation with us going and that you'll come back and that you'll also make sure that we're continuing this conversation with others in the tribal and Indigenous community so that we can make sure that as Colorado is working to engage in active system reform for youth mental health care, that it is doing so in a way that is intentional and inclusive of Native and Indigenous youth. Because as you talked about today, whether it's making sure providers get training, that there is a fundamental recognition of trauma in our systems, it is so important to have inclusion. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll look forward to having you back.
All right. Thank you so much, Heidi. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Speak Our Minds, the fight for youth mental health. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and inspiring. The journey to transform Colorado's youth mental health system is far from over, and your engagement and support are crucial in sustaining this momentum. If you have any questions, comments, or stories you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or visit our website at www.speakourminds.org for more resources and information on how you can get involved. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. Together, we can make a difference and ensure that every young person in Colorado has access to the mental health care they need and deserve. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep advocating for a brighter future. The Fight for Youth Mental Health with your host, Heidi Baskfield. Thank you for listening.